For 70 years, the Vikings were just a seasonal curse, pirates who struck in the summer and vanished by winter. You could hide from them. You could bribe them. But in 865 AD, the rules of survival changed forever. When the mist cleared off the coast of East Anglia, the horizon didn't reveal a raiding party. It revealed a floating city. Hundreds of dragon ships, thousands of warriors. This wasn't a hunt for silver anymore. It was an extermination event. The Great Heathen Army had landed, and for the first time, they didn't want to go home. They wanted your country. Before we descend into the chaos of the Viking invasion, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Enjoy the story. The year is 865 AD. To the monks scribbling in the candle-lit monasteries of England, it seemed as though the gates of hell had finally been flung open. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, our primary window into this dark age, records a shift in tone so terrified you can almost feel the parchment trembling. It describes the arrival of a force unlike anything the British Isles had ever seen. They didn't call it a raiding party. They didn't call it a fleet. They called it the Missel Here, the Great Heathen Army. To understand why this moment was so catastrophic, we have to look at what came before. Since the raid on Lindisfarne in 793, the relationship between the Norsemen and the Anglo-Saxons had been violent but predictable. Vikings were essentially seasonal hazards. They were like a bad storm. They would arrive in the summer, burn a few coastal villages, steal church gold, and disappear back to Scandinavia before the winter seas became too rough. They were a terrifying nuisance, but they were manageable. You could hide from them. You could pay them off. You just had to wait them out. But in 865, the horizon didn't just fill with 3 or 4 longships. It filled with hundreds. This wasn't a disjointed group of chieftains looking for quick loot. This was a coalition. It was a synchronized military migration involving thousands of warriors from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, united under a single, terrifying purpose. They weren't here to steal the harvest. They were here to take the farm. The England they arrived in was not the unified nation we know today. It was a fractured puzzle of 4 rival kingdoms: Northumbria in the north, East Anglia in the east, Mercia in the Midlands, and Wessex in the south. These kingdoms spent more time fighting each other than preparing for external threats. They were rich, divided, and complacent. They viewed the Vikings as a peripheral threat, a problem for the coastal towns. They had no idea that a hammer was about to fall that would shatter the political landscape of Britain for centuries. This army brought with it a new kind of warfare. They didn't just bring swords and axes. They brought women, children, and craftsmen. They brought the intent to settle. This was a hostile takeover on a civilizational scale. Over the next hour, we are going to deconstruct exactly how this force moved across the landscape like a plague. We will analyze the genius of their tactics, the brutality of their politics, and the desperation of the English kings who tried to stop them. We will separate the Hollywood myths from the archaeological reality to answer the ultimate question: how did a loose alliance of heathens manage to bring the most powerful kingdoms of England to their knees? The invasion didn't begin with a battle. It began with a silent, ominous landing on the shores of East Anglia, where the Great Heathen Army stepped off their ships, not to raid, but to wait. The storm had broken, and the flood was about to begin. Every great war needs a spark, a story that justifies the slaughter to the men holding the axes. For the Great Heathen Army, that story was one of the most famous and gruesome tales in medieval literature, the death of Ragnar Lothbrok. If you look at the Scandinavian sagas, specifically the tale of Ragnar's sons, the invasion of 865 was not an economic migration or a tactical conquest. It was a blood feud. The story goes that the legendary sea king Ragnar Lothbrok had been raiding off the coast of Northumbria a few years prior. Luck, which had favoured him for decades, finally ran out. His ship was blown off course and wrecked on the English coast, where he was captured by King Alfred of Northumbria. Alfred was a usurper, a man fighting a civil war to keep his own throne, and he wasn't in the mood for mercy. Recognizing the famous raider, Alfred decided against a quick execution. Instead, he ordered a pit to be dug and filled with venomous snakes. Ragnar was thrown in. The sagas tell us that as the vipers struck and the poison coursed through his veins, Ragnar didn't scream. He laughed. He composed a poem, the Krakumal, and delivered a final, chilling prophecy that would haunt England for a generation. How the little piglets would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers. The old boar was Ragnar. The piglets were his sons. And the prophecy was a promise that his death would be paid for with the ruin of a kingdom. Whether or not Ragnar Lothbrok actually died in a snake pit, or if he even existed as a single historical figure, is a matter of intense debate among historians. It is likely that the Ragnar of legend is a composite of several different Viking chieftains whose deeds were stitched together by skalds over centuries. Snake pits were not exactly a standard method of execution in Anglo-Saxon England. A simple beheading would have been far more characteristic. However, in history, the truth of a story often matters less than its power. Whether Alfred truly murdered Ragnar is irrelevant. What matters is that the Vikings claimed he did. They used this narrative to unify disparate warbands under a single banner of righteous vengeance. Leading this coalition were the piglets mentioned in the prophecy, though they were anything but small. The army was commanded by three brothers, the alleged sons of Ragnar, Halfdan, Ubba, and the most terrifying of them all, Ivar the Boneless. Ivar is a figure who seems to step right out of a nightmare. The origin of his nickname, the Boneless, in Bainlausey, remains a mystery. Some historians speculate it referred to a physical condition, perhaps osteogenesis imperfecta, brittle bone disease, or hypermobility, meaning he had to be carried into battle on a shield. Others suggest it was a metaphor for sexual impotence, or conversely, unnatural flexibility in combat. But the sagas portray him not as a cripple, but as a master tactician, a man whose physical limitations were compensated for by a cruel and brilliant intellect. While other Vikings fought for glory or gold, Ivar fought with a cold, strategic precision. He was the brain of the Great Heathen Army. Ubba and Halfdan provided the muscle. They were archetypal Viking warlords, charismatic, brutal, and capable of rallying thousands of men to their side. Together, these brothers accomplished the impossible. They unified rival Danish chieftains, Norwegian adventurers, and Swedish mercenaries. In the fractious world of Viking politics, where every jarl wanted to be a king, holding such a coalition together was a feat of diplomatic genius. But we must also look past the romantic vengeance myth to understand the real mechanics behind this invasion. Why 865 and why England? The reality is that the Great Heathen Army was likely driven by geopolitics and economics as much as revenge. For decades, Vikings had been raiding the Frankish Empire, modern-day France. They had grown rich, extorting Danegeld, protection money, from the Frankish kings. But by the 860s, the Franks were getting organised. King Charles the Bald had begun fortifying bridges and rivers, making it much harder for Viking longships to penetrate inland. The easy money in Francia was drying up. At the same time, Scandinavia was experiencing a youth bulge. There were too many young men, too many second and third sons with no land to inherit and no wars to fight at home. England, with its 4 squabbling kingdoms and lack of unified defence, looked like the perfect target. It was wealthy, politically unstable, and geographically accessible. The "Vengeance for Ragnar" story served as the perfect propaganda tool. It transformed a predatory war of conquest into a noble crusade. It allowed Ivar and his brothers to recruit men not just with the promise of silver, but with the allure of duty and honour. It legitimized their aggression. When they landed, they weren't just pirates looking for a quick score. They were the executors of a blood debt. So, when the fleet arrived, they carried with them a psychological weapon as potent as their axes. They wanted the English to know that this was personal. They wanted King Alfred to know they were coming for him. However, Ivar the Boneless was smart. He knew that attacking Northumbria immediately, where Alfred was waiting with his armies, would be foolish. A direct assault on a prepared enemy was not the Viking way. Instead, Ivar chose a different entry point. He directed the fleet not to the rocky coasts of the north, but to the flat, marshy fens of East Anglia. He didn't want a battle yet. He wanted a base. He wanted to test the waters of English politics and see just how disjointed the Saxon resistance really was. The piglets had arrived, but they weren't grunting. They were sharpening their tusks, preparing to dismantle the Anglo-Saxon world piece by piece. The vengeance would come, but first they needed to feed the army. In late 865 AD, the residents of East Anglia looked out toward the grey horizon of the North Sea and saw a forest of masts growing from the water. It was an invasion fleet of unprecedented size. Estimates vary wildly. Some medieval sources claim hundreds of ships, others imply fewer. But modern historians, cross-referencing logistical needs with archaeological finds, like the mass graves at Repton, suggest a fighting force of anywhere between 1,000 and 3,000 men. By modern standards, that sounds like a skirmish. By the standards of 9th century Britain, where a king's personal retinue might number in the dozens, it was a weapon of mass destruction. They landed on the coast of East Anglia, likely utilising the intricate network of waterways leading into the fens, a vast marshy region that was notoriously difficult to navigate for outsiders, but perfect for shallow draft Viking longships. The geography here is crucial to understanding Ivar the Boneless's strategy. The fens provided a natural fortress. The waterways offered an escape route back to the open sea if things went wrong, while the marshlands made it nearly impossible for heavy Saxon cavalry or infantry to launch a surprise attack. The Vikings were not just beaching their ships, they were establishing a forward operating base. The King of East Anglia, Edmund, was immediately placed in an impossible position. He was a Christian king, ruling a wealthy but militarily modest kingdom. When his scouts reported the sheer size of the force encamped on his doorstep, Edmund faced the classic dilemma of the weak fighting the strong: fight and risk total annihilation, or negotiate and pay a humiliating price. Edmund chose negotiation. He likely assumed, based on decades of previous Viking behaviour, that these men wanted silver. He prepared to pay the Danegeld, the customary bribe to make them go away. But Ivar the Boneless didn't ask for silver. He didn't ask for gold or slaves or church relics. He asked for horses. This demand terrified the East Anglians. In Viking warfare, ships were the primary mode of transport. Vikings were infantry. They fought on foot in a shield wall. They were not known as cavalrymen. Why would a seafaring army want hundreds of horses? The answer revealed the terrifying evolution of Viking tactics. Ivar didn't want horses to fight from. He wanted horses to fight with. He realized that England was a landlocked theatre of war compared to the fjords of Norway. To conquer the interior, to reach the deep, rich heartlands of Mercia and Northumbria, moving by river was too slow and predictable. He needed rapid mobility. He intended to transform his heavy infantry into a mounted force that could move across the country faster than the English news networks could travel. They would ride to the battle, dismount to fight, and then ride away before a counterattack could be organized. It was the medieval equivalent of blitzkrieg. Edmund, cornered and desperate to get this army out of his kingdom, acquiesced. He supplied the Great Heathen Army with the horses they demanded, essentially providing the invading force with the very vehicles they would use to destroy his neighbours. In exchange, the Vikings promised peace for East Anglia. This peace was a tactical pause, a concept the Anglo-Saxons struggled to grasp. For the Vikings, peace with one kingdom was just a logistical necessity to wage war on another. They spent the winter of 865-866 in East Anglia, not fighting but preparing. This was the most dangerous phase of the invasion, yet it passed without a major battle. During this winter, the nature of the Michael here became apparent. They weren't just warriors huddling around campfires. They were an organised society on the move. They set up supply lines, they forged weapons, they gathered intelligence. It is highly probable that during these months, Ivar and his brothers were meeting with spies and dissidents from the other English kingdoms. They learned about the terrain, the roads, and most importantly, the politics. They learned that Northumbria, the kingdom to the north, was tearing itself apart. The Northumbrians had recently deposed their king, Osbert, and replaced him with Aelle, the same Aelle from the Snake Pit legends. But Osbert was still alive, and the kingdom was effectively split between two rival factions. The Northumbrian nobility was so busy fighting each other that they had completely ignored the monster growing in the south. For Ivar, this was the signal. A divided enemy is an easy enemy. The behaviour of the Great Heathen Army in East Anglia that winter also marked a psychological shift. They acted with an arrogance that suggested they were untouchable. They demanded food and lodging from the local population. This wasn't a raid where they grabbed what they could and ran. This was a hostile takeover. They were essentially quartering themselves on the civilian population. eating through the winter stores of the East Anglian peasantry. This period of peace drained East Anglia of its resources almost as effectively as a raid would have. By the time spring approached, Edmund's kingdom was economically exhausted, his stables were empty, and his granaries were depleted. The Vikings, on the other hand, were well-fed, rested, and now fully mounted. The strategic brilliance of this delay cannot be overstated. Had they attacked immediately upon landing in 865, they would have faced a fresh English resistance, and they would have been foot-slogging through unfamiliar territory. By waiting until late 866, they allowed the internal conflicts in Northumbria to fester. They allowed their own men to acclimate to the English climate and terrain. They turned a mob of boat crews into a mounted expeditionary force. As the snow melted in the spring of 866, the mood in the Viking camp shifted from preparation to action. The horses were saddled, the ships were secured, or perhaps left behind with a rear guard. The Great Heathen Army turned its back on the coast. They didn't head back to sea. They turned north, toward the Roman roads that cut straight through the heart of England. The piglets were ready to honour their father. The target was York. The target was Aila. And thanks to the unwitting assistance of King Edmund, they were coming with the speed of the wind. The Northumbrians, still squabbling over their petty crown, had absolutely no idea what was thundering toward them up the old Roman highway. The ride north was a masterclass in logistics. In November 866, a column of thousands of mounted Vikings surged up the old Roman road known as Ermine Street. This paved highway, a relic of the fallen Roman Empire, acted as a direct artery from the south of England straight into the heart of Northumbria. The Vikings were using the infrastructure of the past to destroy the powers of the present. Their target was the city of York, or Eoferwick, as the Anglo-Saxons called it. York was the jewel of the north. It was an ancient city, ghost-haunted by Rome. It was enclosed by massive stone walls that had stood for centuries, protecting a thriving hub of commerce, religion, and administration. Strategically, if you held York, you held the north. It sat at the confluence of the rivers Ouse and Foss, controlling access to the sea and the interior. Ivar the Boneless chose the date of his arrival with sadistic precision. He didn't just show up on a random Tuesday. He timed the assault for November 1st, All Saints' Day. On this holy day, the cathedral leaders and the aristocracy were gathered in churches. The city guards were likely relaxed, perhaps drunk from feasting, or distracted by religious observances. The vigilance of the city was at its absolute lowest. Furthermore, the harvest was in. The barns of York were bursting with grain, prepared for the winter. By attacking now, Ivar ensured his army would not only take the city, but would also capture the food supply needed to sustain them for another year. It was a move that suggests the Vikings had detailed, inside intelligence on Christian holidays and local logistics. When the Great Heathen Army appeared before the walls, the resistance was pathetic. The city, distracted by the civil war between Kings Osbert and Aila, was woefully unprepared. The Vikings breached the defences with terrifying ease. They didn't burn York to the ground, a crucial deviation from the mindless barbarian stereotype. They occupied it. They slaughtered the resistance, evicted the elite, and settled in. The ancient Roman walls now protected Danish invaders. For the Northumbrians, this was a catastrophe. The loss of York was a decapitating strike. It finally forced the two rival kings, Osbert and Aelle, to realise that their petty civil war was meaningless in the face of this existential threat. In a rare moment of Anglo-Saxon unity, the rivals met, shook hands, and combined their armies. They spent the winter of 866 to 867 raising a massive host, determined to liberate their capital. The counterattack came in March 867. It was Palm Sunday, another holy day, perhaps chosen by the English to invoke divine favour. The combined Northumbrian army marched on York. They were driven by desperation and a thirst to reclaim their holy city from the pagans. At first, it looked like the English might win. The Vikings, seeing the size of the Northumbrian host, retreated behind the city walls. The English, emboldened, attacked the fortifications. The Roman walls of York were old and crumbling in places. The Anglo-Saxons managed to breach them. They poured into the city, screaming for blood, convinced that they had the invaders trapped. But they had walked into a slaughterhouse. Urban warfare is a nightmare for an attacking army, especially one relying on sheer numbers rather than discipline. Once inside the narrow, winding streets of York, the Northumbrian numerical advantage evaporated. The Vikings, veterans of close-quarters combat, turned the city into a kill zone. Ivar the Boneless had likely prepared for this exact scenario. The streets became choke points. The shield walls formed unbreakable barriers in the alleyways. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes the result with grim brevity. There was an excessive slaughter made of the Northumbrians, some within, some without. The trap snapped shut. The English army was not just defeated, it was annihilated. In the chaos, King Osbert was killed, cut down in the mud of the city he once ruled. But for King Aelle, the man who had allegedly thrown Ragnar Lothbrok into the snake pit, a darker fate awaited. Historical sources diverge here. The English sources simply say Aelle was killed in battle, but the Norse sagas insist that he was captured alive. The sons of Ragnar had their prize. The prophecy was about to be fulfilled. According to the legend, Ivar, Ubba and Halfdan subjected Aelle to the blood eagle, Blodorn. This ritual is perhaps the most infamous aspect of Viking lore. The sagas describe the victim being prone, their ribs severed from the spine with a sword, and pulled outward to resemble wings. The lungs were then pulled through the opening, fluttering with the victim's final breaths like a bird in flight. Did this actually happen? Historians are sceptical. There is no contemporary evidence from 867 confirming the blood eagle was performed. Many argue it is a literary invention of later Christian writers trying to depict the Vikings as demons, or Norse poets trying to make their ancestors look terrifying. However, whether the ritual was anatomically performed or just a poetic metaphor for a brutal death, the outcome was the same. Aelle was obliterated. The Northumbrian royal line was extinguished in a single afternoon. The impact of the Battle of York cannot be overstated. In one stroke, the Great Heathen Army had destroyed the kingdom of Northumbria. It ceased to exist as an independent Anglo-Saxon state. But Ivar didn't stop at destruction. He engaged in state building. He didn't want to rule the day-to-day administration of a resentful Northumbrian populace. That was too much work and tied down his army. Instead, he installed a puppet king named Egbert. Egbert was a Northumbrian noble who was willing to collaborate. He would collect the taxes, keep the peace, and funnel resources to the Viking army. He was a manager, the Vikings were the shareholders. This was a sophisticated imperial strategy. By using a puppet king, the Vikings maintained the illusion of Northumbrian continuity while holding all the real power. It freed the Great Heathen Army to leave York and look for new targets, knowing their rear was secure and their supply lines were open. York was transformed. It became Jorvik. Under Viking rule, it would grow into one of the most important trading ports in northern Europe. It became a melting pot where Scandinavian and Saxon cultures fused. The streets were widened, workshops were built, and trade routes to the east were opened. The Vikings brought combs from the Baltic, silk from Byzantium, and amber from the north. The city that had been a crumbling Roman relic was revitalized into a bustling Viking metropolis. But for the rest of England, the fall of York was a terrifying signal. The north had fallen. The piglets had avenged their father. The blood debt was paid. By all logic, the Great Heathen Army should have packed up, loaded their ships with Northumbrian silver, and gone home rich men. They didn't. In the south, the King of Mercia and the King of Wessex watched with growing horror as the army didn't disband. Instead, the Vikings rested, refitted, and turned their eyes south. The vengeance myth had served its purpose. Now the mask was off. This was no longer about Ragnar Lothbrok. This was about England. The Great Heathen Army gathered its strength, left its puppet king in charge of the ashes of Northumbria, and marched toward the kingdom of Mercia. The war was not over. It had only just begun. In the year 868, the Great Heathen Army did something that terrified the Anglo-Saxons more than any act of violence. They moved with purpose. After securing York, they didn't scatter to raid the countryside. They marched south, crossing the border into Mercia, the kingdom of the Midlands. Mercia was the superpower of the previous century, a kingdom of vast wealth and military tradition. Yet, as the Viking column snaked its way toward the strategic town of Nottingham, the Mercian king Burgred froze. Burgred knew what had happened in Northumbria. He knew that the Northumbrian kings had tried to fight the Vikings alone and had ended up dead or tortured. He realized that Mercia, for all its historic strength, could not stand against the Missel Hair in isolation. So he did something unprecedented. He swallowed his pride and sent a desperate messenger south to the kingdom of Wessex. He appealed to King Ethelred of Wessex and his younger brother, a prince named Alfred, the man history would later call the Great. This was a watershed moment in English history. For centuries, Mercia and Wessex had been bitter rivals, constantly fighting over borderlands and supremacy. The idea of them joining forces was almost unthinkable. But the Viking threat was an existential solvent. It dissolved old hatreds out of sheer necessity. Ethelred and Alfred answered the call. They gathered the West Saxon army and marched north to join King Burgred. For a brief moment, it looked like the tide might turn. The combined might of Mercia and Wessex was a formidable force. They had the numbers. They had the home field advantage. They marched on Nottingham, where the Vikings had seized the fortress and bunkered down for the winter. The stage was set for the decisive battle of the age. On one side, the Great Heathen Army, undefeated and hungry. On the other, the unified flower of English nobility, desperate to defend their land. The English surrounded the town. They set up their siege lines. They shouted challenges at the walls, demanding the heathens come out and fight like men. And the Vikings did absolutely nothing. Ivar the Boneless and his brothers, looked over the walls of Nottingham, saw the massive Anglo-Saxon host, and simply refused to engage. This was the discipline of the Great Heathen Army on full display. A lesser force might have been baited into a glorious, suicidal charge, but the Vikings were pragmatic professionals. They knew that in a pitched battle against the combined armies of Wessex and Mercia, they would likely lose, or at least suffer casualties they couldn't replace. So they waited. They sat comfortably behind the strong defensive walls of Nottingham, eating the food stores they had captured, while the English army sat outside in the mud. Siege warfare in the 9th century was a brutal affair for the attacker, not just the defender. The English armies were composed largely of the fyrd, militias of farmers who needed to be home to harvest their crops. They couldn't stay in the field forever. Keeping thousands of men fed and sanitary in a siege camp was a logistical nightmare that the Anglo-Saxons weren't equipped to handle for long periods. As the weeks dragged on, the English alliance began to fray. Disease likely started to spread in the camp. The harvest season was approaching. The Vikings were not starving. The English were losing patience. The siege of Nottingham ended not with a bang, but with a transaction. Realizing they couldn't breach the walls and couldn't wait the Vikings out, the English kings capitulated. They offered a Danegeld. They paid the Vikings a massive sum of silver to leave Mercia and go back to York. It was a humiliating anticlimax. The Vikings took the money, laughed at the English, and marched back to York, their army intact, their coffers full, and their reputation invincible. They had faced the combined might of England and walked away richer without barely lifting a sword. But this was only a temporary reprieve for Mercia. The Vikings played the long game. They returned to York to consolidate their power, but they kept their eyes on the Midlands. Over the next few years, they wore Mercia down through a campaign of attrition. They launched raid after raid, destabilizing the region, destroying the economy, and eroding the people's faith in King Burgred. In 874, the Great Heathen Army returned to Mercia, not to negotiate, but to finish the job. They set up camp at Repton, the sacred burial place of the Mercian kings. This was a psychological blow, striking at the spiritual heart of the kingdom. Archaeologists excavating Repton have found a D-shaped fortress built by the Vikings, incorporating the stone church into their defences. Nearby, they found a mass grave containing at least 264 people, mostly robust men, likely members of the Great Army who had died of disease or wounds, buried around the central figure of a high-status Viking warrior. King Burgred, broken by years of stress and realizing his kingdom was lost, abdicated. He fled to Rome to live out his days as a pilgrim, abandoning his people to the wolves. But once again, the Vikings showed their political savvy. They didn't just annex Mercia directly. That would require too many men to garrison. Instead, they found a Mercian collaborator. They found a nobleman named Ceolwulf. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by West Saxon monks who hated collaborators, describes Ceolwulf with dripping contempt as a foolish king's thane. They paint him as an idiot, a traitor, a puppet who danced on Viking strings. However, modern historians view Ceolwulf II differently. He wasn't necessarily a fool, he was a pragmatist. He looked at the reality on the ground. The old royal line had fled, the army was broken, and the Vikings were unstoppable. He chose to work with the occupiers to salvage what he could of his country. The arrangement was simple and brutal. The Vikings gave Ceolwulf the crown of Mercia. In return, he swore oaths to them, gave hostages, and promised that the kingdom would be ready for them whenever they required it. He was allowed to rule the western half of Mercia, while the Vikings took the eastern half for themselves to settle. This was the puppet king strategy refined to perfection. By installing Ceolwulf, the Vikings effectively neutralized Mercia. They turned a former enemy into a vassal state. Ceolwulf's Mercia acted as a buffer zone, protecting the Viking conquests from the Welsh to the west and the Saxons to the south. The partition of Mercia was a tragedy for the English. The kingdom that had once dominated the island was now sliced in two. The eastern half, which included important centres like Lincoln, Nottingham, Derby, Leicester and Stamford, became known as the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw. These became fortified Viking city-states, each ruled by a jarl or earl, operating as a confederation. The fall of Mercia in 874 left only one kingdom standing. East Anglia was a vassal, Northumbria was a Viking colony. Mercia was broken and half-occupied. Only Wessex remained. The Great Heathen Army, now bloated with wealth and confident in their invincibility, looked south across the Thames. They saw the last free Anglo-Saxon kingdom. They saw the rich lands of King Ethelred and Prince Alfred. They saw the final obstacle to total domination of the island. But before they turned their full fury on Wessex, there was one loose end to tie up. The King of East Anglia, Edmund, the man who had given them horses years ago, had stopped paying his tribute. He was growing rebellious. It was time to remind him, and the rest of England, what happened when you defied the great army. The Vikings turned their horses back toward the fens. It was time for another lesson in terror. By late 869, the Great Heathen Army had completed a terrifying circuit of England. They had started in East Anglia, conquered Northumbria, broken Mercia, and now, like a predator returning to a wounded prey, they circled back to where it all began. They returned to East Anglia. But the dynamic had changed. 4 years earlier, King Edmund had bought them off with horses. He had treated them as a temporary nuisance, a problem that could be solved with commerce. Now, he realized that the problem wasn't going away. The guests he had equipped were now the masters of the North and Midlands. And this time, they weren't looking for a trade deal. They were looking for total submission. The return of the Vikings to East Anglia marks one of the most culturally significant moments in the entire Viking Age, not because of a great battle, but because of a great death. It is the moment where the invasion transformed from a war over land into a war over the soul of England. The army, led by the omnipresent Ivar the Boneless and his brother Ubba, set up their winter quarters at Thetford. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle gives us the dry military facts. The army rode across Mercia into East Anglia and took up winter quarters at Thetford. And that winter King Edmund fought against them, and the Danish took the victory and killed the king and conquered all that land. Short, brutal, final. But if we dig into the hagiographies, the saints' lives written by monks like Abbot of Fleury, a much more grotesque and symbolic story emerges. These accounts, written a century later but based on oral traditions, paint the conflict not as a military defeat but as a religious martyrdom. According to these traditions, Edmund decided that he could no longer pay the Danegeld. The demands of the Vikings had become insatiable. More importantly, as a Christian king, he felt that paying tribute to pagans was a spiritual failure. He raised his army, perhaps realizing it was a suicide mission, and met the Vikings in battle. The result was a massacre. The East Anglian forces were swept aside by the veteran Viking machine. Edmund was captured alive. What happened next is the stuff of nightmares and high medieval art. Ivar the Boneless, ever the psychological terrorist, supposedly offered Edmund a choice. He could live and even continue to rule as a puppet king under Viking authority, on one condition. He had to renounce his Christian faith and bow to the Norse gods. He had to acknowledge that Odin was superior to Christ. For Ivar, this was a power play. Breaking a king's army is one thing, breaking his spirit is another. If he could force a Christian monarch to apostatize, it would prove the supremacy of the Viking worldview. It would demoralize every Christian in Britain. Edmund refused. He stood defiant, declaring that his duty was to God first and his kingdom second. Enraged, or perhaps delighted by the opportunity to make an example, Ivar ordered Edmund to be tied to a tree. The Vikings then used the king for target practice. Archers lined up and fired volley after volley into his body. The texts describe him being covered in arrows like a hedgehog or like the bristles of a thistle. Yet he refused to die or renounce his faith. Finally, frustrated by his resilience, Ivar ordered his head to be hacked off. The death of Edmund sent a shockwave through the Anglo-Saxon psyche. In the short term, it was a disaster. East Anglia ceased to exist as an independent kingdom. Its lands were seized, its nobles killed or enslaved, and its monasteries looted. The Great Heathen Army now controlled the entire eastern seaboard of England, from the Thames up to the Scottish border. But in the long term, Ivar had made a tactical error. By torturing and executing Edmund for his faith, he created a martyr. Edmund became Saint Edmund. His cult spread like wildfire. He became a symbol of English resistance and spiritual purity. In death, he was far more dangerous to the Viking occupation than he ever was in life. A mere king can be defeated. A saint is immortal. For centuries afterward, even the Viking settlers who eventually converted to Christianity would revere St. Edmund. There is a bizarre postscript to this gruesome event. Legend says that the Vikings threw Edmund's severed head into the thick, bramble-choked woods to prevent his followers from giving him a Christian burial. When the monks went searching for the head, calling out, "Where are you?" they heard a voice answer, "Here, here, here." They followed the sound and found a great wolf, normally a beast of war and death in both Saxon and Norse mythology, guarding the head, protecting it from other scavengers. The wolf allowed the monks to take the head and then vanished back into the forest. This story, blending Christian miracle with folkloric animal symbolism, highlights the confusion and trauma of the time. The world was being turned upside down. Kings were dying in the mud. Wolves were guarding saints. The natural order was collapsing. With East Anglia secured, the Great Heathen Army underwent a significant structural change. The coalition began to fracture slightly, not from infighting, but from success. They now controlled so much land that they needed to split their forces to manage it. Halfdan, one of the original brothers, took a portion of the army back north to Northumbria. He was done with raiding. He wanted to farm. The chronicle tells us he shared out the land of the Northumbrians, and they proceeded to plough and to support themselves. This is a crucial pivot point. The Vikings were putting down roots. They were becoming English. But the main body of the army, the hungry heart of the beast, was not done. They were still led by the ambitious kings who wanted more. They looked south, across the border of East Anglia, toward the rolling chalk hills of Wessex. Wessex was the prize. It was the domain of King Ethelred and his brother Alfred. It was the only kingdom left with a standing army and a central government. If Wessex fell, England would become Daneland. The Anglo-Saxon history would end, and a new Scandinavian era would begin. The Vikings knew that Wessex would be the hardest nut to crack. The West Saxons were tough, well led, and they had been watching the other kingdoms fall one by one. They knew the Vikings were coming. In late 870, the Great Heathen Army mobilized from Thetford. They didn't wait for spring. They moved in the dead of winter, using the frozen ground to speed their march. They bypassed the border defences and struck deep into the heart of Wessex, seizing the royal estate of Reading. Reading is situated between the rivers Thames and Kennet. Just like in York and East Anglia, the Vikings used the geography to their advantage. They built ramparts between the two rivers, creating an instant, unassailable triangular fortress. From this base, they sent out raiding parties to torch the villages of Berkshire. The message to King Ethelred was clear. "We are here. We are in your home. Come and remove us, if you can." For the first time, the Great Heathen Army was about to face a leadership team that was its equal. King Ethelred was a warrior king, and his younger brother Alfred was a prodigy, a young man of high intelligence, neurotic energy, and fierce piety. They didn't panic. They didn't offer a Danegeld. They called out the Fyrd. The year of battles was about to begin. 871 would see 9 major pitched battles between the Vikings and the West Saxons. The fields of Wessex were about to be soaked in blood. The Vikings had steamrolled Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia, but in the green hills of Wessex they were about to hit a wall. As the Vikings sharpened their axes inside the ramparts of Reading, and the West Saxon Fyrd gathered their spears in the countryside, the fate of the island hung in the balance. The unstoppable force was about to meet the immovable object. The year 871 is known in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles as the Year of Battles. It was a year where the soil of Wessex drank more blood than rain. It began with a bold strategic gamble by the Great Heathen Army. They had seized Reading, a royal estate of the West Saxon kings, and turned it into a fortress. By wedging themselves between the River Thames and the River Kennet, and digging a massive rampart between the two, they created a stronghold that was virtually impregnable. From this base, they dared the Saxons to attack. It was a classic trap. If the Saxons attacked the fort, they would be slaughtered in the ditches. If they didn't attack, the Vikings would ravage the countryside until the kingdom collapsed from economic exhaustion. King Ethelred and his brother Alfred had no choice. They mobilized the Fyrd, the peasant militia, and marched to Reading. But before the main armies could clash, the local ealdorman of Berkshire, a man named Ethelwulf, managed to intercept a Viking raiding party at Englefield. In a surprising turn of events, the Saxons won. They drove the raiders back. It was a small victory, but it proved a crucial point. The Vikings were not invincible. They bled just like anyone else. Buoyed by this success, Ethelred and Alfred launched a full-scale assault on the Reading Gate 4 days later. It was a disaster. The Vikings burst out from their gates like wolves, shattering the Saxon shield wall and sending the king and the prince fleeing into the marshes. The reality of the war set in. The Vikings were professionals and the Saxons were amateurs. The Saxon army retreated to the Berkshire Downs to lick its wounds. They needed to regroup. But the Vikings, sensing blood in the water, didn't give them time. They marched out of Reading, moving to the high ground of the Downs, intent on crushing the West Saxon army once and for all. This led to the Battle of Ashdown, the single most famous engagement of the early Viking wars. The setup for the battle has a cinematic quality that almost feels scripted. The Vikings arrived first and seized the high ground, a massive tactical advantage. They split their army into 2 divisions. One was led by the Viking kings Bagseg and Halfdan. The other was led by the Jarls, the earls. Seeing this, the Saxons mirrored the formation. King Ethelred would take his household troops to fight the Viking kings. Prince Alfred, just 21 years old, would take his men to fight the earls. But as the sun rose over the frost-covered hills, a dangerous delay occurred. The Vikings were forming their shield walls, banging their weapons, screaming insults, ready to charge downhill. But the Saxon king was missing. Ethelred was in his tent, attending Mass. He was a deeply pious man, and he refused to leave the service until the priest had finished the prayers. Outside, Alfred was watching the Viking line advance. He was in a frantic position. He was the junior commander. He couldn't order the king's men to charge, but he knew that if they waited for the priest to say Amen, the Vikings would swarm down the hill and slaughter them where they stood. The psychological pressure on the young prince must have been immense. He was staring at annihilation. Alfred made a decision that would define his legend. He didn't wait for his brother. The chronicler Asser writes that Alfred led his troops forward like a wild boar. It wasn't a disciplined march. It was a desperate, uphill charge into the teeth of the enemy. The fighting centred around a lone, gnarled thorn tree on the hillside. This tree became the anchor point of the battle, the eye of the storm. The shield walls crashed together with the sound of thunder. For hours they hacked and shoved in the mud. It was brutal, intimate violence, men looking into the eyes of the men they were killing. Eventually Ethelred finished his prayers and joined the fray. Whether it was the fresh troops or divine intervention, the Saxon line held. And then it pushed back. The Viking king Bagseg was cut down. 5 of the Viking earls were killed. The leadership of the Great Heathen Army was decimated. Panic set in. The Vikings broke. They turned and fled back toward Reading, with the Saxons pursuing them until nightfall, cutting down stragglers for miles. Ashdown was a glorious victory. The bodies of thousands of Vikings littered the hills. It proved that the heathens could be beaten in a pitched battle. But this is where the story takes a grim, realistic turn. In a movie, the credits would roll after Ashdown. The heroes won. The bad guys died. But in history, the war didn't stop. The Vikings had lost a king and 5 earls, but they still held the fortress at Reading. And just 2 weeks later, they were back in the field. They defeated the Saxons at Basing. 2 months later, they defeated them again at Meriton. The victory at Ashdown, bought with so much blood, had changed nothing strategically. The Vikings were like a hydra. Cut off one head and 2 more grow back. And in 871 a new head appeared. A fresh fleet arrived in the Thames. This was the Great Summer Army, a new wave of invaders led by a warlord named Guthrum. They joined forces with the survivors of the original Great Heathen Army. The Saxon nightmare had just doubled in size. Under the strain of constant defeat and the arrival of these reinforcements, the West Saxon leadership collapsed. King Ethelred, exhausted and likely wounded from the constant campaigning, died shortly after Easter 871. This left Alfred alone. Alfred did not inherit a celebration, he inherited a catastrophe. He was crowned King of Wessex not with pomp and circumstance, but in a hasty ceremony while the enemy was burning his villages. He was a king of a broken army and a terrified people. He was 22 years old, suffering from a chronic, painful illness, likely Crohn's disease, and facing the largest Viking army ever assembled. His first act as king was to ride out to Wilton to face the combined Viking forces. He lost. The Saxon army was simply too small and too tired to fight any more. Alfred, showing the pragmatism that would later make him great, realized he couldn't win on the battlefield. Not yet. He needed time. So he did what the other kings had done. He opened the treasury. He paid the Danegeld. He bribed the Vikings to leave Wessex. It was a humiliating start to his reign. He had charged like a wild boar at Ashdown, but now he was paying the extortionist like a coward. But Alfred knew something the other kings hadn't. Money can be replenished. Dead men cannot. He bought peace to rebuild his army. The Vikings, happy with the massive payout and the rich lands of the north, agreed. They turned away from Wessex. They marched to London, to Mercia, and to Northumbria to settle their new conquests. For the moment, Wessex was safe. The storm had passed over the house, but it hadn't dissipated. It was merely circling. The Great Heathen Army now controlled the north, the east, and the Midlands. They had surrounded the last English kingdom. The years between 871 and 878 were a phony war. The Vikings were busy carving up England, sharing out land and becoming landlords. They were transitioning from raiders to rulers. Guthrum, the new leader of the Viking forces, declared himself king of East Anglia. But Guthrum was ambitious. He wasn't satisfied with 3/4 of England. He wanted the whole map. He knew that as long as Alfred lived and Wessex stood, the conquest was incomplete. Wessex was the beacon of resistance, the last safe harbour for the English. In January 878, Guthrum decided to finish what Ivar the Boneless had started. He didn't want a battle. Battles were risky, as Ashdown had proven. He wanted an assassination. He broke the truce. He ignored the winter norms of warfare. In the dead of night, just after Christmas, Guthrum led his army in a lightning strike toward the royal estate at Chippenham, where Alfred was celebrating the 12th night. He wasn't coming for territory, he was coming for the king's head. 12th night, January 878. The royal hall at Chippenham was likely warm, filled with the smell of roasted meat and the sounds of a court unwinding after the Christmas festivities. King Alfred and his thanes were secure in the belief that winter was a time of peace. In the medieval world, you didn't fight in January. The roads were mud, the fields were frozen, and the days were short. War was a summer activity. Guthrum, the warlord of the Great Summer Army, was counting on that assumption. Under the cover of darkness, a massive Viking force emerged from the winter gloom. They didn't march with banners flying. They moved with the silence of assassins. They bypassed the border guards and struck Chippenham with terrifying speed. The attack was a masterstroke of treachery and tactics. The West Saxons were caught completely off guard. The gates were breached before an alarm could be raised. The halls were flooded with mail-clad warriors before the Saxons could reach for their spears. It was a slaughter. Most of the royal court was killed or captured in the first hour. Alfred barely escaped. The history books don't give us the specific details of his flight, but we can imagine the chaos. The King of Wessex, the last hope of Christian England, fleeing into the night with a handful of loyal guards, leaving his home, his wealth, and his dignity behind in the burning ruins of Chippenham. Guthrum had won. In a single night he had shattered the West Saxon government. The aristocracy surrendered. The people, terrified and leaderless, submitted to Viking rule. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the bleak reality. The army rode over Wessex and occupied it, and drove many of the people overseas, and of the remainder, the greater part they subdued and forced to obey them, except for King Alfred. Except for King Alfred. That phrase is the hinge upon which English history turns. Alfred didn't flee to France. He didn't go to Rome. He went into the mud. He retreated to the Somerset levels, a vast, desolate landscape of marshes, peat bogs and waterways that were virtually impassable to anyone who didn't know the secret paths. He established a hidden base on the Isle of Athelney. This was the nadir of the Anglo-Saxon world. The King of Wessex was no longer living in a palace. He was living in a hut, in a swamp. He was a king without a kingdom, a general without an army. This period is the source of the famous legend of the burnt cakes. The story goes that Alfred, disguised as a peasant, was sheltering in a swineherd's hut. The swineherd's wife asked him to watch some cakes baking by the fire while she went out. Alfred, consumed by worry over his kingdom, let them burn. When the woman returned, she scolded the King of England for being useless. While the story is likely a later folk tale, it captures a true historical essence. Alfred had been stripped of his majesty. He was at rock bottom. But Athelney was not just a hiding place, it was an incubator. From this swamp fortress, Alfred began to wage a new kind of war. He couldn't face Guthrum in a pitched battle. He had no men. So he became an insurgent. He launched hit-and-run guerrilla attacks on Viking foraging parties. He intercepted messages. He made the Vikings bleed for every inch of Wessex they tried to occupy. He was buying time. He was waiting for the winter to pass, sending out messengers through the secret network of the Fens to the men of Wiltshire, Somerset, and Hampshire. The message was simple. The king is alive. Keep your swords sharp. Wait for the signal. While Alfred was playing the Swamp King in Somerset, another critical event occurred that signalled the tide was about to turn. Ubba, the brother of Ivar the Boneless and one of the original commanders of the Great Heathen Army, landed on the coast of Devon with 23 ships. He was coming to crush the resistance from the west, creating a pincer movement to trap Alfred in the marshes. He laid siege to a hill fort called Kinwit, where a group of Saxon rebels had taken refuge. Ubba was confident. The Saxons in the fort had no water. He just had to wait for them to die of thirst. But the Saxon leader, a certain Odda, realized that waiting meant death. So, at dawn, instead of surrendering, the Saxons burst out of the fort in a desperate, suicidal charge. They caught the Vikings sleeping. In the stunning upset that followed, Ubba, the son of Ragnar, the terror of the north, was killed. Over 800 Vikings were slaughtered on the beach. But the Saxons took more than just lives. They took the Raven Banner. The Raven Banner was a totem of immense power to the Great Heathen Army. It was said to have been woven by the daughters of Ragnar Lothbrok in a single noontide. The Vikings believed that if the raven on the flag flapped its wings, victory was assured. If it drooped, they would lose. Losing the banner was a catastrophic psychological blow. It suggested that Odin had withdrawn his favour. When the news reached Alfred in the marshes, it must have felt like a divine sign. Ubba was dead. The magic banner was captured. The invincible brothers were gone. Only Guthrum remained. Spring arrived in May 878. The marshes began to dry. The time for guerrilla warfare was over. Alfred decided to gamble everything on one throw of the dice. He sent the signal. He summoned the Fyrd of Somerset, Wiltshire and Hampshire to meet him at a place called Egbert's Stone. It was a rallying point on the border of the forest, a place tied to the memory of his grandfather, King Egbert. The scene at Egbert's Stone is one of the most emotional moments in the chronicle. When the men of the Fyrd, farmers, smiths and fathers who had been living under the shadow of Viking occupation for months, saw their king ride out of the forest alive and ready to fight, the text says they were overjoyed. This wasn't just a military muster, it was a resurrection. They had thought England was dead. They had thought their king was a ghost. But here he was, flesh and blood, with a plan. Alfred didn't waste time with speeches. He marched them immediately toward Guthrum's position. Guthrum was encamped at Edington, confident in his control of the kingdom. He likely had no idea that a full Saxon army had materialized out of thin air until the scouts came galloping back, screaming that the king was coming. The march to Edington took 2 days. Alfred drove his men hard. He knew he had to strike while morale was high, and while Guthrum was still scrambling to form his lines. On the morning of the battle, Alfred deployed his men in a single massive shield wall. This was the traditional Saxon formation, a dense forest of overlapping limewood shields bristling with spears. Opposite them stood the Great Summer Army. These were men who had conquered 3 kingdoms. They were veterans, killers, and conquerors. They outnumbered the Saxons. They had better weapons. And they were led by Guthrum, a king who had never known a decisive defeat. But the Saxons had something else. They had the anger of the oppressed. They were fighting for their farms, their wives, and their God. And they were led by a man who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and come out the other side. The Battle of Edington was not a skirmish. It was a grinding, day-long slugfest. There were no fancy manoeuvres, no flanking cavalry. It was shield against shield, weight against weight. It was a test of sheer will. For hours the line surged back and forth. The noise would have been deafening, the clash of iron on wood, the screams of the dying, the roar of the commanders. If the Saxon line broke, Wessex died. If the Viking line broke, the invasion ended. Slowly, agonizingly, the Viking line began to buckle. The Saxons, fueled by the resurrection of their king, pushed harder. They didn't break formation. They stepped over the bodies of their friends and drove their shields into the faces of the invaders. And then the impossible happened. The Great Heathen Army broke. The Vikings turned and fled. This time, Alfred didn't stop. He pursued them ruthlessly, cutting them down as they ran toward their fortress at Chippenham. He didn't let them regroup. He drove them into the gates and immediately laid siege. Alfred had learned from the mistakes of the past. He didn't just sit outside and wait. He stripped the surrounding area of all food and cattle. He starved them. For 2 weeks, Guthrum and his survivors sat inside Chippenham. They were cold, terrified, and starving. They had seen the Raven banner fall. They had seen the dead king return. They realized that their gods had abandoned them. Guthrum sent a messenger. He surrendered. But Alfred didn't want another Danegeld. He knew that gold runs out. He wanted a permanent solution. He wanted Guthrum's soul. The terms of the Treaty of Wedmore were shocking. Alfred demanded that Guthrum leave Wessex, yes, but he also demanded that Guthrum be baptized. The Viking warlord had to submit to the Christian God and accept Alfred as his godfather. It sounds absurd to modern ears, forcing a conversion as a war aim. But to Alfred, this was the ultimate victory. By becoming Guthrum's godfather, he became his spiritual superior. He bound Guthrum into the hierarchy of the Christian world. A Christian king could not raid another Christian king without damning his soul. It was a way to civilize the beast. Amazingly, Guthrum agreed. 3 weeks later, the Viking warlord was baptized at Aller, with Alfred raising him from the holy water. Guthrum took the Christian name Athelstan. The Great Heathen Army was officially dissolved. The storm had finally broken against the shield wall of Wessex. The baptism of Guthrum at Aller was a spectacle of surreal contradictions. Here was the King of the Danes, a man who had spent his life burning monasteries and slaughtering monks, now standing in a white christening robe, renouncing Thor and Odin and accepting the body of Christ. King Alfred, his godfather, stood beside him, lightly smiling through gritted teeth. It was a diplomatic triumph, but every Saxon present must have asked the same question. Can we trust him? Remarkably, the answer was yes. Guthrum, now known as Athelstan, largely kept his word. In 880, after spending a year wintering at Cirencester, keeping a close eye on Mercia, he moved his army back to East Anglia. But this time they didn't go as raiders. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says they settled the land and shared it out. This is the moment the Great Heathen Army effectively ceased to be an army and became a nation. They hung up their swords and picked up ploughs. They took over the estates of the dead East Anglian nobility and became the new aristocracy. This region, covering East Anglia, the 5 boroughs of the East Midlands and southern Northumbria, calcified into a political entity known as the Danelaw. To formalise this new reality, Alfred and Guthrum signed a document known as the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum. It is one of the few surviving legal texts from this period, and it is fascinatingly pragmatic. It didn't speak of grand ideologies. It spoke of borders and business. It drew a line across the map of England, running roughly along the old Roman road of Watling Street. To the north and east lay the Danelaw, where Viking law and custom prevailed. To the south and west lay Saxon England, under the guidance of Alfred. The treaty also set up exchange rates for Vergild, blood money, between Danes and Saxons, essentially establishing legal equality between the two peoples. If a Saxon killed a Dane, he paid the same fine as if he had killed a Saxon. It was an admission that the Vikings were here to stay. But Alfred was not naive. He knew that while Guthrum might be satisfied, the Viking world was teeming with other hungry warlords. The Great Heathen Army had been a coalition, and splinter groups were constantly breaking off or arriving from the continent. Peace with Guthrum was not peace with the Northmen. Alfred knew that if he wanted Wessex to survive the next wave, the old system had to die. The traditional Anglo-Saxon defence relied on the fyrd, farmers gathering with spears when the alarm was raised. This system was slow, reactive, and localised. By the time the farmers arrived, the Vikings had already looted the village and left. So, Alfred initiated one of the most ambitious state-building projects in the history of the Middle Ages. He turned Wessex into a fortress. He designed a network of fortified towns known as burhs, from which we get the word borough. These weren't just military outposts, they were planned urban centres. He revitalised old Roman walled cities like Winchester and Exeter, and built brand new earthen fortresses like Wallingford and Wareham. The genius of the system was the grid. He spaced these burhs so that no village in Wessex was more than 20 miles, a single day's march, from a fortress. If Vikings landed, the rural population could retreat into the burh. More importantly, the garrisons from neighbouring burhs could ride out and intercept the raiders before they could escape. To pay for this colossal infrastructure, Alfred reorganised the tax system and the military service requirements. He created a document called the Burgel Hidage, a list that assigned a specific number of hides, land units, to support each fortress. It was a mathematical formula for national defence. For every pole of wall, you needed 4 men to defend it. This was a revolution. Alfred transformed a loose tribal kingdom into a centralised military state. He also realised that waiting for Vikings to land was a fool's game. He needed to meet them on the water. The Chronicle claims Alfred designed his own ships, swifter and steadier than the Danish longships, effectively founding the Royal Navy. While this is likely royal propaganda exaggerating his naval success, the intent was clear. Wessex would no longer be a passive victim. The test of this new system came in 885 and 886. A new Viking army arrived from Francia and besieged Rochester. But this time, the script flipped. The people of Rochester didn't surrender. They retreated behind the walls Alfred had reinforced and held out. Alfred's mobile field army arrived quickly and crushed the besiegers. The system worked. Emboldened by this success, Alfred decided to make a symbolic strike that would define the future of England. He looked toward London. London in the late 9th century was a ruin. The old Roman city of Londinium was largely abandoned, a ghost town of crumbling stone within massive walls, while a trading settlement called Lundenwic had grown up along the Strand outside the walls. For decades it had been a Viking playground, a place of tribute and terror. In 886, Alfred marched on London. The details of the siege are lost to history, but the result was seismic. Alfred stormed the city, evicted the Viking garrison and, crucially, didn't just loot it, he restored it. He moved the population back inside the safety of the Roman walls. He repaired the defences and appointed his son-in-law, Ethelred of Mercia, to govern it. The retaking of London was the psychological turning point of the Viking Age. It proved that the tide had truly reversed. The Vikings were no longer the inevitable conquerors. They could be rolled back. This victory led to a spontaneous political evolution. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that after London fell, all the English people that were not under subjection to the Danes submitted to him. Before this moment, Alfred was the king of the West Saxons. After London, he began to style himself as the king of the Anglo-Saxons. It was the embryonic beginning of England, a unified nation of Saxons, Mercians and Jutes, bound together not just by language, but by a shared Christian identity and a shared enemy. The Great Heathen Army had inadvertently created the very thing that would eventually destroy them. By shattering the old, weak kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia and Mercia, they had cleared the board. They forced the survivors to coalesce around the only strong leader left. Ivar the Boneless had come to conquer a divided land, but his invasion forged a united one. By the late 880s, the map had stabilised. The island was a diarchy. In the north and east, the Danelaw, a land of Norse customs, where Thor was toasted alongside Christ, and where society was structured around the freedom of the independent farmer. In the south and west, the kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons, a highly militarised Christian state, bristling with fortresses and administered by a scholar king. But the story of the Great Heathen Army has one final chapter. The warriors who had arrived in 865 were getting old. Ivar was dead, reportedly dying in Dublin in 873. Ubba was dead. Halfdan was dead. Guthrum was ruling as a Christian king. The generation of the sons of Ragnar was passing. However, the legacy they left behind was not just a political line on a map. It was in the blood and the soil. They hadn't just conquered, they had colonized. In the Danelaw, thousands of Viking warriors settled down with local women. They gave their children Norse names. They renamed the villages, anything ending in by, Derby, Whitby, Grimsby, or Thorpe, Scunthorpe, is a Viking signature on the landscape. They changed the language. Old English and Old Norse collided in the marketplaces of the Danelaw. To understand each other, they simplified the grammar. They dropped the complex endings of words. They started using Norse words that we still use today. Sky, egg, window, husband, take, give, they, them, there. The Great Heathen Army had failed to conquer all of England, but they had succeeded in changing it forever. They were no longer them. They were becoming us. As Alfred lay on his deathbed in 899, he looked out at a kingdom that was vastly different from the one he had inherited. It was scarred, militarized, and poorer, but it was still standing. He had held back the darkness. But he knew, and his son Edward knew, that the Danelaw was still there. The unfinished business of the 9th century would become the wars of the 10th. The Great Heathen Army was gone, but the Vikings were already part of the fabric of England. The invasion was over. The integration had begun. When we look back at history, We often measure the success of an army by the borders it drew. By that metric, the Great Heathen Army was a partial failure. They never conquered Wessex. They never unified the island under a single Danish king, at least not in the 9th century. The dream of Ivar the Boneless to turn Britain into a western extension of Scandinavia was halted by the stubborn resistance of a sick man in a swamp. But if we measure success by legacy, then the Great Heathen Army was perhaps the most successful invasion force in British history, rivalled only by the Romans and the Normans. They didn't just leave behind burnt monasteries and buried hoards of silver. They left behind a genetic, linguistic, and cultural imprint that is still visible today. The most enduring monument to the Great Heathen Army isn't a statue or a castle. It is the map of England. If you drive through the East Midlands or Yorkshire today, you are driving through the ghost of the Danelaw. Every town ending in by, meaning farm or village in Old Norse, was likely a Viking settlement. Derby, Rugby, Whitby, Grimsby, these were the homes of the men who marched with Ivar. Every village ending in thorp, meaning hamlet, or toft, meaning homestead, tells the same story. Scunthorpe, Lowestoft. These names are linguistic fossils, preserving the memory of the Danish settlers who traded their axes for ploughs. The division of England between Alfred's Wessex and Guthrum's Danelaw created a cultural fault line that persisted for centuries. The North and East developed a distinct identity. Even centuries later, legal codes distinguished between English law and Dane law. The people of the Danelaw were freer. The peasantry there suffered less from the crushing manorial serfdom that developed in the south. The fierce independence of the north of England today has its roots in the free-holding Viking farmers of the 9th century. But the deepest conquest was of the English tongue. The Vikings didn't force the English to speak Norse, but the two languages, Old English and Old Norse, were close cousins. As Saxons and Danes intermarried, traded and argued in the market squares of Jorvik and Lincoln, the languages melded. The result was a simplification of English that made it the flexible, global language it is today. We stripped away the complex grammatical genders of the Germanic roots to make it easier for the two groups to communicate. And we adopted their words. Every time you say the word sky, you are speaking Norse. Every time you say egg, steak, knife, dirt, or hell, you are using the vocabulary of the Great Heathen Army. Most profoundly, they gave us our pronouns. They, them, and their are Norse words. It is incredibly rare for a language to borrow such fundamental grammatical building blocks. That the English adopted them suggests an integration so deep that the us versus them mentality eventually dissolved completely. The Vikings became us. Politically, the Great Heathen Army set the stage for the birth of England. Before Ivar arrived, England was a mess of 4 squabbling kingdoms. By destroying Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia, the Vikings inadvertently cleared the board. They destroyed the competition for the House of Wessex. When Alfred's son, Edward the Elder, and his magnificent daughter, Ethelflad, the Lady of the Mercians, began the reconquest in the 10th century, they weren't just liberating land. They were absorbing the Danelaw into a new unitary state. Because there were no other Saxon kings left to challenge them, the King of Wessex became the king of all England. The Great Heathen Army, by destroying the old order, made the unification of England possible. The story of the Great Heathen Army is not just a story of blood and wolves. It is the story of a migration. It is the story of how a group of heathen pirates stormed a Christian island, terrified it, broke it, and then joined it. They came as the wrath of God. They stayed as neighbours, and in the end, they became ancestors. So the next time you look at a map of England, or use the word happy, or endure a Thursday, remember the year 865. Remember the sons of Ragnar. They didn't just burn the history books, they wrote a whole new chapter.